It is showtime, and I am so sorry for being late. I had to walk Mary Lou home. So we are welcome everybody to the Saturday night stream. We are doing Jordan Peterson. Let me see if I can figure out which screen I need to share. Brave tab. Is that the one? Oh my goodness. I got too many tabs going on. I'm late and I'm all kerfuffled. I think that's the one. Yes. Okay. So I found the one that I'm supposed to be on. Got way too many tabs open. All right. Let's try this again. Share screen, Brave tab. Is that the one? Is that it? Nope. Maybe. I don't know. That's not the right one. Go back to me. Too many tabs. All right. Share screen. Stop. Share the right screen. Share screen. Can you guys tell that I had a heck of a day? All right, there's the screen. Yay! We found it. All right, how y'all doing tonight? I see Justin, one person is here. I've got to tell my mother that I'm live. I forgot to do that too. Oh my goodness. So just to tell you how my day was, I went to bed at 8 o'clock last night with a killer migraine. Oh, there's Shell. There's Listening Mantis. Yay, I have people here. So, where is my mother? I am live now. Okay. So yay, we have people here. Sorry for being late. I'm just a bit of a mess right now. So I need to, no, not that one. We're not going to play that one. We're going to play this one. We are at 1:45 for Bible series. This is the third video, and we're just about to move to video 4. So we're at the end of this one, and I need to get my stuff in order. I need my smoky treat. I need my drinky treat so I don't lose my voice, but I can start you guys with Jordan and have that be a thing. So I will be right back. There you go.
Which is the notion that you should be able to recognize in yourself all the horror of humanity and take responsibility for it, because that's what that means. And the thing that's so interesting about that is that if you can recognize yourself, in yourself, all the horror of humanity, you will instantly have a hell of a lot more respect for yourself than you did before you did that. Because there's some real utility in knowing that you're a monster. Now, and just because you're a monster doesn't mean you have to be a monster, but it's really useful to know that you are one. So, and one of the things that Jung knew, and this is something that I find so amazing about his writings, I think something that really distinguishes him, for example, from Joseph Campbell, who talked about following your bliss, is like Jung said very clearly that the first step to enlightenment is the encounter with the shadow. And what he meant by that was everything horrible that human beings have done was done by human beings, and you're one of them. And so if you don't understand that, and to understand that really means to know how it was that you could have done it. And that's a shattering thing. To try to imagine that, to try to imagine yourself as someone who's engaged in medieval torture. To see.
Now that is an important point. So all the things evil that have been done throughout history have been done by other human beings, just like me, just like you. So if we don't realize that we are fully capable of torture, of murder, I mean, everybody goes, oh, well, I'll never do it. You know, I'll never commit murder. Well, you don't know. You don't know the circumstances that you may be in. You know, somebody molests your child, well, that could turn you into a murderer. You know, somebody, kills your spouse in front of you. Well, you might just kill them back. I'd never be involved in torture. Well, maybe not. And none of us, can say, I would never do that. That can't even be a thing in our vocabulary. I would never do that because we're all capable of it. Each and every one of us, you, me, our neighbors, we are all capable of that kind of horror. So, you know, it's something that is instantly humbling. To realize that could be me. That could be me. So, Justice, you're very tired and very snowed in. Yeah. I was late today because I was walking Mary Lou home. We were playing cards and nobody told me that she's a total card shark. I may have to remind her whose turn it is and what she needs to do in the turn. But other than that, wicked card player. And she kicked my butt 3 games in a row. So I need to be more careful. But let's get back to Jordan here.
See how you could, in fact, do that. You're never the same after you learn that. But being never the same after learning that is unbelievably useful because when you understand that that's what you're like, then you're a whole different creature. And I don't think, and this is something I did learn from Jung, is that you cannot be a good person until you know how much evil you contain within you. It is not possible. And
Yes.
it's partly because you just don't have any potency. Like, if you're just naive, if you're just nice, if you've never hurt anyone, you've never hurt a fly, you don't have the capability for any of that, why would anyone ever take you seriously? You're a domestic animal at best, and a rather contemptible one at that. And it's a very strange thing because you wouldn't think that the revelation of the capacity for evil is a precondition for the realization of good. But I believe that, first of all, why would you be serious enough to even attempt to pursue the good unless you had some sense of what the consequence was of not doing it? You have to be serious about these sorts of things. It's not the game of a child, right? It's the game of a fully developed adult.
Yes.
I learned this in part when I had little kids. I wrote a chapter for my new book called "Never Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them." And why was that? And wrote that after I knew I was a monster. And I thought, I'm going to make sure I like my kids. I'm going to make sure they behave around me so that I like them. Because I'm way bigger than them.
Yep.
And I'm way more cruel than they are.
Yep.
I've got tricks up my sleeve that they cannot even possibly imagine.
Yep.
And if they irritate me, I will absolutely take it out on them. And if you don't think that you're the sort of person that would do that, then you are the sort of person who is doing it.
That's important. That's very important.
We're not going to get that in me. I watched this great documentary once called Hitman Hart. It was about Bret Hart, who was the most famous Canadian in the world for a while. And he was a Worldwide Wrestling Federation wrestler, and he was a good guy. And he came from this famous family of wrestlers who all came from Alberta. I think there were 7 brothers who were wrestlers and 7 sisters, and all the sisters married wrestlers. And they were all offspring, children of Stu Hart, who was a wrestling impresario like 40 years ago. And it was such a cool documentary because I was always wondering, why in the world do people watch wrestling and believe it, believe it. Do you believe movies when you go watch them? It's like, that's a hard question to answer. Well, you're there, you do. And so if you're watching wrestling and you're a wrestling fan, do you believe it? Well, it isn't a matter of belief. It's a matter of being engaged in a drama. And there are different levels of drama, right? So let's say Worldwide Wrestling Federation drama is not the most sophisticated form of drama. Okay, but I'm not being
arguably
a smart aleck when I'm saying that. There is drama of different sophistication for different people. And that's also why religious truths exist at multiple levels simultaneously, right? There's got to be something in it for everyone. And that's a hard belief system. That's a hard system to put together. something for the unbelievably sophisticated, and something for the common person. Okay, so we have wrestling, and Bret Hart was a good guy. He fell into the archetype of being a good guy, and that's part of what the story's about. It was a bit too much for him. But one of the things that he laid out so carefully was because he figured that 120 million people knew him, something like that, and that everywhere he went, he was treated like a hero. And he found that quite a burden, as you can imagine, if you think about it. But he portrayed what was happening in the wrestling ring as classic good against evil, but not conceptualized and discussed, right? Embodied, fought out, acted out, you know, like Thor and the Hulk, except like right in front of you. And so,
if you've ever seen the series, the Netflix series Sense8, it's oh, please do, Justice. Tell Survival to join. Text him. I missed his stuff earlier today because I was working. But yeah, please have him join us. In Sense8, there's this beautiful scene where there's this art history teacher, and he's explaining how wrestling is the archetype of good versus evil, and how we all want good to triumph over evil, and how it's a drama play of, you know, even hey, Angry Joker, good to see you. So it's, you know, wrestling even is the same thing as opera, for goodness sake. You know, it's all the same, good versus evil, only in wrestling you actually get to see them fight it out live. I mean, isn't that the coolest? So yeah, it was very interesting how they brought that in to Sense8 to explain that, you know, it's high drama. Wrestling is high drama. And so I thought that was really, really cool. So,
well, that's exactly this sort of thing. I mean, we could consider hockey more sophisticated than wrestling, perhaps. And as I said, I'm not being a critic of these. I'm not being critically minded about these things. I understand their purpose, and I would highly recommend that documentary. It's a brilliant documentary. But it's the same thing. It's a silver cup, right? It's like, there's the hero of the team. That's the hero of the teams. You know, here's something cool. If you're the fan of the Toronto Blue Jays or the Toronto Maple Leafs, of course, this hardly ever happens to you if you're the fan of the Toronto Maple Leafs because they always lose. But if you're watching a game and your team wins and we take your testosterone levels, then they went up. And if you watch the Toronto Maple Leafs and they lost and you're a fan, then your testosterone levels go down.
wow.
So that's pretty damn funny. You know, I mean, really, don't you see how deeply instantiated this is in people? I mean, it bloody well alters your biochemistry, like your testosterone levels. It's all, no, my team lost. You know, like, there'll be nothing in it for the wife tonight. You know. Well, this is the cosmos, I think, from the phenomenological perspective. And one of the things that has come to my realization is that this is real. This is real. It's not a metaphor. It's way deeper than a metaphor. The most real things about life are the place you don't know and the place you know. And you could say, well, that's explored territory and unexplored territory. That's real, and it's been around forever. Back to the lobsters. You know, if you put lobsters in a new place, the first thing they do is go around their territory, finding places to hide, and also making a burrow. So the first thing they do is establish what they know against what they don't know. And that's real. It's real from the Darwinian perspective. And we're going to say that what's real from the Darwinian perspective is plenty real enough, because we're alive and everything. And so that sort of thing matters. Like, well, that's what this is. The Taoist symbol, that's what it says. Is what it says, what is experience made of? Eternally. That's easy. Chaos and order. And in every bit of chaos, there's the possibility of order. And in every bit of order, there's the possibility of chaos. And that's the way, right? That's the path of life. That's life itself. And where you're supposed to be is right on the border between the two of those. And why is that? Stable enough, engaged enough, right? So not only are you doing what you should be doing, you're doing it in a way that increases the probability that you'll do it better tomorrow. And you can tell when you're doing that because you're engaged. You're in the right time and place. And your neurology tells you that. That's what meaning is. That's what transcendent meaning is. And that's
it's more than just one cannot survive without the other. One cannot exist without the other. If you get rid of all the evil, you just find a new evil. I mean, that's what happened in the Soviet Union. You know, once you had everybody agreeing with you and you had purged all the previous people, well, then it just became more, you just had a higher level of purity that you had to achieve, and you would purge out the bottom of that, and a higher level of purity and purge out the bottom of that. And so it was just purge after purge after purge after purge. And so that's why you never want to try and reach for utopia. It's because you never reach it. And in the process of trying to reach it, you destroy everyone. So, hey, Lawrence, glad you're here. So, yeah, the balance. There's got to be a balance. And you don't want to try and eliminate one or the other, because there will always be good and evil, and there will always be evil and good. You know, it's one of those things. It's like, you know, you know, in trying to achieve good, you reach for justice, and with justice, there's punishment, and you know, it's all a mishigash unless you can try and create that balance, that yin and yang, and the two circle each other all the time. So there's always this motion going on and everything like that. Justice says, gotta have the lows to have the highs, gotta have the downs to appreciate what up is. Exactly. Because if everything's just that, there's no good, there's no bad. It's just, you know, and it's you're frozen at that point. You're frozen. So but yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating to realize how sophisticated all of this stuff is, and how much you can just sit there and think about it and think about it and think about it. I mean, as we said, we're on video 3 and we haven't even gotten to Adam and Eve yet, you know? Isn't that amazing? So here we go.
so cool, because I also think that that is the antidote to existential suffering. The antidote to existential suffering is to be at the right place at the right time. And you know, you want to get technical about it. Okay, anxiety and pain. That's the reality of existential suffering. Okay, so let's say you're in the right place at the right time. What happens to you biochemically? Dopaminergic activation. What does that do? Suppresses anxiety, and it's analgesic. Now, it's more than that, because it also produces positive emotion and the desire to move forward, and it underlies creativity. And so not only do you get the positive engagement from a neurochemical perspective, you get the analgesia, and you get the and you get the reduction of anxiety. So it's not hypothetical. And it is the case that the dopaminergic systems, those are the exploratory systems, unbelievably ancient and archaic, are activated when you're optimally positioned to be incorporating new information, which is what human beings do, because we're information foragers. And so we want to be secure, but building on our security at the same time. And then we want to do it for ourselves, we want to do it for other people, we want to do it for our families, we want to do it for broader society. We want to bring the whole world together in alignment to do that, and that's meaningful. And God only knows what we could do about the suffering of the world if we did that. You know, we have no idea what we could do if we started doing things properly. And maybe so many of the things that dismay us about life, we could stop. We stopped a lot of them in the last 100 years. You know, things are a lot better than they were 100 years ago.
Yes.
Obviously, they're not perfect. But 100 years ago, 120 years ago, man, you know, the average person in the Western world lived on less than $1 a day in today's dollars. It's like, you just try that for a week and see how much fun that is. So the Taoists, well, what is this? Well, this is the pre-cosmogonic chaos out of which the Word of God extracted habitable order at the beginning of time. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. And that chaos, we'll talk a bit more about that later, I guess, because it's a very complicated thing to describe. But it's certainly the thing that when you encounter, the chaos is what you encounter when the Twin Towers fall.
Yes.
Right? You remember what that was like, right? So it was September 10th. Well, that was the world. Everyone knew what the world was like. And then it was September 11th, and everyone walked around dazed for 3 days because the buildings fell. But so what? You can see a building fall. You can understand what happens when a building falls. So then what's going on with the being dazed? Well, it's the chaos that underlies our habitable order manifested itself when those buildings collapsed. It was a brilliant act of terrorism. And everyone was frozen and curious because that's how we react to that sort of thing. It's like the shark. Remember that famous movie poster for Jaws with the woman swimming on the top of the water and that terrible Leviathan shark underneath coming up to take her out. Well, that's life, man. That's the world. And now and then you see that. And when something falls, like the Twin Towers fall, you remember that the ocean below you, the abyss, right, the primordial abyss, that bloody thing is deep.
Yeah.
And you're fragile. And that happens when someone betrays you, and it happens to you when your dreams fall apart. You encounter that chaos again from which the world is extracted, and then you're called upon to act out attention and the word in order to bring the world back into order. And none of that is superstitious. None of that is superstitious. None of that's even metaphorical. It's real.
It's very real.
It's more real than anything else. And I think the reason for that in part is that it's been this way forever.
Yeah.
Right? As long as there's been life, this has been the rule of life. And that's the cosmos. That's reality. That's what we inhabit. And so one of the things, the so-called new atheists, and I don't want to go on a tangent about new atheists because I think atheists are often remarkably honest and very consistent in their analysis. So, but I just don't think they're taking the problem seriously. I don't think they take their evolutionary theorizing nearly with the seriousness that it necessitates. And I don't think that you can dispute the proposition that the longer something has had a selection effect on life, the more real it is. It's the fundamental axiom of Darwinian biology. And I think the Darwinian world is more real than the physical world. That was the argument that I was trying to have with Sam Harris, and I didn't do the world's best job of that, although it went not too bad the second time. But it's not something to be taken lightly. It's a very serious, profound, and meaningful proposition. And people act it out and want to act it out whether they know it or not. That's Marduk. So the story of Marduk, I'll just give it to you very briefly. Tiamat and Apsu were locked in embrace at the beginning of time. Goddess of salt water, god of fresh water, together. Chaos and order, right? They give rise, masculine and feminine, they give rise to the world of the elder gods. And those are, to me, they're primordial motivational forces. They're something like that. And their rage and their lust and their love and all these things that possess us that are there forever. And they're out in the world acting. And they carelessly slay Apsu, their father. And they're making a racket, and then they kill Apsu. And then Tiamat gets wind of that. And that's Tiamat right there, by the way. She's kind of a rough-looking creature. And she's the mother of all things. And so she's not very happy about this. Her children have destroyed structure itself.
Yep.
Plus, they're noisy and careless. And so she thinks, all right, just like Noah, just like the God that brings the flood to Noah. Exactly the same idea. Tiamat comes back and says, yeah, okay, enough is enough. I'm going to take you out. And she makes this battalion of monsters and puts the worst monster there is at the head of the battalion. His name is Kingu. He's like a precursor to the idea of Satan. And she lets the gods know, hey, I'm coming for you. And so they're not very happy about this because they're gods, but like, yeah, she's chaos itself, right? She gave birth to everything. This is no joke. And so they send one god out after another to confront her, and they all come back with their tails between their legs. There's no hope. And then one day there's a new god that emerges, and that's Marduk. And the gods know, as soon as he pops up, they know he's something new. Remember, and this is happening while the Mesopotamians are assembling themselves into one of the world's first great civilizations. So all the gods of all those tribes are coming together to organize themselves into a hierarchy to figure out what proposition rules everything.
Yep.
And so Marduk is elected by all the gods, and he says, look, I'll go out there and I'll take on Tiamat, but here's the rule. From here on, you follow me. I determine destiny. I'm the top god. I'm the thing at the top of the hierarchy. And all the other gods say, hey, look, no problem. You get rid of chaos, we do exactly what you say. Now, Marduk, he has eyes all the way around his head, and he speaks magic words. Those are his primary attributes. And so he takes a net, and he goes out to confront Tiamat. And he encloses her in a net, which I think is so cool because it's an encapsulation, right? It's a conceptual encapsulation. He encloses chaos itself in a conceptual structure. He puts it in a net, and then he cuts her into pieces, and he makes the world. And then...
Now, this is cool. So he was telling about how this is all the different civilizations of Babylonia coming together with all their different gods and everything like that. Yes, hi, shaman. Good to see you. So all these different tribes with all their different gods are coming together, and all the different tribes are trying to decide among them who's top tribe, who's top god. So they come up with this new structure. This is the story of their civilization in myth. So they come up with this idea that, okay, if you can come up with a new god, if you can come up with a new way to encapsulate chaos and to have that, have that chaos destroyed, if you can, this chaos of us coming together, if you can figure out a way for us to come together and to be able to all get along, we'll all follow you. So that they're dramatizing the the evolution of their civilization in their mythology. So to a certain extent, this is true. This is not just some story that they came up with, but this is the story that happened to their own civilization for the construction of Babylon. And that, if somebody can come up with a way for all of us to sit in a hierarchy, and be in order and to deal and to get rid of all that chaos, then yes, we'll all follow you. So this was them. I mean, it's just so cool to think about that not only is this myth, and not only is this their guiding myth, but this is what they actually went through in order to become the Babylonian civilization. And that's why these stories are both stories and they're real. They're both myth and they're history all at the same time. And that's why, we can't really write off the Bible. I mean, sure, there may be some things where it's not the same way that we would record history, in 1573, blah, 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 blah. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. They weren't exact like that. They told them in dramas so that, that it was easier for people to remember. It's easier for people to remember the plot of Spider-Man than it is to remember the War of the Roses, that sort of thing. So it's playing on the psychology of the day and what people had, because they didn't have pencil and paper. They had stone and chisels. Are you going to write everything down? No, you're only going to, weed out and put up the important stuff. So what important stuff are you going to put together? Well, all these tribes came together with this different god and that different god. And this god, in order to deal with the chaos of the civilization of trying to get us to all work together, this tribe came up with an idea and they came forward. Well, that didn't work. And this tribe came up with an idea and that didn't work. They're trying to assault the chaos and it's not working. And so they get sent home with their tails tucked between their legs. Yes, Listening Mantis, Shakespeare did this for us as well. He dramatized history. But by then they had paper, so they could be a little bit more exact about it and a little more true to form about it. But these guys had to do it in poetic form in a way that would fit to their poetic structure and, be able to be recited over and over and over again. So this tribe's plan didn't work. Their god got vanquished. This tribe's plan didn't work. Their god got vanquished. Finally, somebody came up with a new god, a new way of ordering things, and that became Marduk. And Marduk actually became what they called their king. And that's, I believe, what Jordan Peterson is going to get into now. So let's listen to that.
Then he creates human beings to inhabit that world and to serve the gods. And he creates human beings out of the blood of King, the worst of the demons. And that took me to Colin DeYoung, who's a student of mine, helped me figure that out. I thought, geez, that's pretty damn pessimistic. It's like, what exactly? It's like a fall metaphor. It's like the idea of original sin, but our joint conclusion with regard to that is that human beings are the only creatures in creation that can truly deceive. Right? We have the capacity for evil, just like it says in the Adam and Eve story. We can actually do that, and that's why we're made out of the blood of the king of the demons. We are that thing that can deceive, that can twist the structure of reality. Well, so Marduk, the Mesopotamians had an emperor, right? And the emperor was the avatar of Marduk. That's what made him emperor. He was only an emperor if he was going to be Marduk. He had to be a good Marduk, which meant he had to confront chaos and cut her up and make order out of her pieces. And what the Mesopotamians used to do at the New Year's celebration, they'd go outside their walled city, and that's explored territory versus unexplored territory. They'd go outside their walled city into chaos, and they'd bring all the statues that represented the gods, and they'd act this out. Because they're trying to figure something out, right? They're trying to figure out what this means. They're acting it out. And then they'd take their emperor, and the priest would make him kneel, and they'd take all his king uniform off, his emperor uniform off, and make him kneel and humiliate him and nail him with a glove and say, okay, how were you not a good Marduk this year, right? And then he'd recount all the ways that he was inadequate in confronting chaos, and then they'd do the celebration, and Marduk would win, and the king would go sleep with a royal prostitute. And the reason for that was it's the same idea as St. George pulling the virgin from the dragon. It's exactly the same idea, that if you encounter the reptilian chaos, you can extract something out of it with which, if you unite, you produce creative order. That's what they were acting out. And that was the basis for the Mesopotamian idea of sovereignty. It's so smart. It's so unbelievably smart. And the Mesopotamians had a massive influence on the civilizations that then had a massive influence on us. It's one of the stories of how the notion of sovereignty itself came to be. It's the evolution of the idea of God. That's one way of thinking about it. But even more importantly, it's the evolution of the idea of the redemptive human being, right? And that's taken to one of its conclusions, well, in the story of Buddha, but also in the story of Christ, the idea of the perfect individual. And the notion is, well, that's the word that speaks truth into chaos at the beginning of time to generate habitable order that is good. That's the story. And so with that, I'll just show you these pictures because they're so interesting. Once you know what they mean, they're so cool. That's a symbol of infinity. Like Hercules and the Hydra. What's life like? Cut off one head. What happens? 7 more grow, right? What do? Run home? Well, no, that's not what you do. This is what you do. You fight it. It's the chaos that generates partial chaos. It's the ultimate chaos that generates partial chaos. But that chaos also is what revivifies life, because otherwise it would just be static. Mercury, the head of the Hydra, right, freezes you. That's St. George. He's doing it peacefully, which is so interesting, right? He's got a beatific look on his face in that particular representation. Another St. George, right? The Virgin in the background. I think that's St. Anne, if I remember correctly. St. George, he's the patron saint of England. Here's an interesting one. This actually sheds light on the human proclivity for warfare. St. George, that's a Muslim soldier. It's really easy to transform the enemy into the dragon, right? Because the enemy is often the predator, and we do that instantaneously, right? Without a second thought. And so then we can go to war morally, because why not take out the snakes? Well, the problem is, where are the snakes? Well, maybe they're outside, and maybe they're not. Maybe they're in this room, and even worse, maybe they're in you. Mm-hmm. That's wisdom, when you know that they're in you. Why wouldn't she be happy about that? Especially if she had a child, right? Seriously. And that's Horus, right? The god of vision. And he was a falcon, because falcons have great vision. They fly above everything and they can see everything. So that was the Egyptian creator god, Horus. And I'll tell you the story about Horus at some point as well. Now, here's some pictures that demonstrate what I had described as the emergence of, let's say, the meta-hero out of the hero. So there's the person you admire, and then there's the set of people that you admire, and then there's the meta set of admirable people, and the extraction of that ideal. As far as I can tell, that's just what's portrayed in these images. That's a great one. It's a very sophisticated image. You see the two sides of Christ's face are not
symmetrical.
One's God and one's man. That's what that icon means. And so the fully developed person in this representation, it's one of the oldest representations of this sort that we know. The idea is that there's the human person in his ordinariness, let's say, and then there's this kinship with the divine that's associated with the willing adoption of the responsibility of mortal being. And that produces this union. And then it's manifest in a book, right? Because that's speech, and it's associated with the sun, right? It's the proper way of being. And that's a perfect example, I think, of the emergence of the archetype out of the multitude. That's what it looks like to me.
Those are all saints. And the martyred saints.
And so I guess now we're done with Genesis 1, and that took 3 lectures, but God's complicated, you know? That's the thing. So thank you. And next week, by all appearances, that's where we are. So
all right, so he's going to open up to questions now, and we can go to the next video in the series. But I'm going to go ahead and pause here for a second for station identification. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to pause here because I wanted to talk about my finances. I'm trying to pay for, I just upgraded so I could do 1080p on my videos, and I need to do this for my work also. You know, all of this is getting very, very expensive. And so I was asked, and I hate asking for money. I hate it. 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 I want to be able to do all of this on my own. I don't want to ask for anything like that, but I have set up a Subscribe Star. And I believe, let me see if I can pull it up. Subscribe Star. I have a Subscribe Star page so that I can support this. And, you know, you guys can support me, you know, kind of like, yeah, you know how Subscribe Star works. And doing a membership for, you know, what I'm doing here. And I'm currently under review, but this will be up. And in the meantime, you know, I also have Cash App, and I believe I have a banner for that. Here's my Subscribe Star. And it hasn't been approved yet, but it will be. And that's what my Subscribe Star is. And then this is my Cash App here. And if you guys could just spare a little bit of money. As you know, I recently dropped my iPad. It was a choice between dropping the dog and dropping the iPad. And so I dropped the iPad. And my mother was able to get me a new one. But on a condition of that, I need to be able to make $100 a month doing this. Otherwise, I can't really afford it because it's cutting into everything else. And I wasn't able to do any sort of payment plan or anything like that because I'm already at the edge of my expenses. beyond the edge of my expenses, I should say. So if you guys could do me the blessed favor of just providing a little bit of support for me and for this channel, I would greatly appreciate it, because I'm not monetized on YouTube yet. I don't have enough people. I can't do I can't do, what are they called, super chats or anything like that. So this right now is the only way to support me. Hopefully when the subscribe star comes up, once I get approved for that, we'll be able to do that too. But I made a promise to my mother that I would try and make $100 a month doing YouTube, so even if you just have $5 to spare, that would help, even if it's just $2. I don't know what the minimum thing on Cash App is, but if you guys could just, anything that you can provide, I would be greatly, greatly appreciative. And that would allow me to keep my promise to my mother. So I've got a couple of months to be able to achieve this. But in the meantime, that's what I'm going to try and do. So I have to start e-begging, and I hate e-begging. But I have to, because there's no other way. I'm on a fixed income with my disability. So if you guys could spread the word, even get more people viewing, that'd be great. But we're going to head on to the next video now. I just stopped the share. Where's my share? There's my share. All right. So now we are on to Jordan Peterson Biblical Series number 4.
Hello, everyone. So hopefully we're going to get past Genesis 1 today. That's the theory. So I finished my new book yesterday. Yeah, so that's taken about 3 years of writing. It's quite a long time to write something. So yeah, it's done, except for the mopping up, copy editing and that sort of thing. So hopefully it's as good as I can make it. I don't know if it's any good, but it's as good as I can make it anyways. All right, so this is the stories that I'm going to tell you tonight. I've been thinking about, well, like the ones last week for that matter, for a very long period of time, but I think these even longer. And one of the things that I just do not understand, I cannot fathom this. I cannot understand how there can be so much information in such tiny little stories, especially the story of Cain and Abel. That story just, every time I read it, it just flattens me, because it's only like a paragraph long. There's just nothing to it, And I think about 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 it, and every time I think about it, another layer comes out from underneath it, and then another layer comes out from underneath it. And I can't figure that out. Like, the rational approach that I'd be describing to you is predicated on the idea that these stories have somehow encapsulated wisdom that we generated interpersonally and behaviorally, and then an image over very vast stretches of time, and then condensed it into very, very dense, articulated words that are then further refined by the act of being remembered and transmitted and remembered and transmitted and remembered and transmitted over vast stretches of time. And that's a pretty good argument. I'm willing to go with it, but it still never ceases to amaze me how much information such tiny little passages can contain. So we'll take that apart today. And I think it's especially true with the story of Cain and Abel, because it works on the individual level, and it works on the familial level, and it works on a political level, and it works at the level of warfare, and it works at the level of economics, and that's a lot for a little tiny one paragraph story to cover. Now, you could object, well, it's stories, you never know what you're reading into it and what's in the story, right? That's part of, let's call it the postmodern dilemma, and fair enough. And there's really no answer to that. any more than there is an answer to how do you know your interpretation of the world is, well, let's not say correct, but sufficient. There's some answer to that. It's sufficient in if you can act it out in the world and other people don't object too much and you don't die and nature doesn't take a bite out of you any more often than necessary. Those are the constraints within which we live. So you have some way of determining whether your interpretation is at least functionally successful, and that's not trivial. And I guess you can say the same thing for the interpretations that might be laid out on these stories. And at the moment, that's probably good enough. Hopefully, you find the interpretations functionally significant at multiple levels. And I also think the chance of managing that by chance is very, very small. To be able to pull off an interpretation of a story that works at multiple levels simultaneously, you think with each level that it applies, the chances that you stumbled across something by chance have to be decreasing, right? There's a technical term for that in psychology. It's called something like multi-method, multi-trait method of determining whether or not something is accurate. And the idea is the more ways that you can measure it and get the same result, the more confident you can be that you're not just deluding yourself with your a priori hypotheses, that there's actually something out there. So I guess that's another part of this method, is that it's also a method that I use in my speaking. I think I don't try to tell people anything that isn't personally relevant, because you should know why you are being taught, right? You should know what the fact is good for, and then it should be good for you personally, at least in some sense. And then if you act it out in the world, it should be good for your family and maybe should have some significance for the broader community. And I think that's what meaning means. And I don't really see the utility in being taught things that aren't meaningful, facts that aren't meaningful, because there's an infinite number of facts and there's no way you're going to remember all of them. They have to have the aspect of tools, essentially, something like that, because we are tool-using creatures. Well, these stories have that aspect. As far as I can tell, there's no doubt about that. So here's the stories in Genesis 2, very famous stories, obviously. Virtually everybody who's even vaguely versed in Western, roughly speaking, Western culture knows these stories. And that's something that's interesting too, that stories can be so foundational that everybody shares them. I mean, you can say the same thing about a fairly large handful of fairy tales as well, or you could at least until recently. But the fact that stories are foundational, I think, also means that they have to be given a kind of, well, even if you don't give them any respect, you have to at least treat them as remarkable curiosities. So why those stories, and why did they stick around, and why does everybody know them? And it's not self-evident by any stretch of the imagination, and you can use explanations. You can use the Freudian explanation. Freud sort of thought that the Judeo-Christian was predicated on the idea that the figure of the father, the familial father, was expanded up into cosmic dimensions so that mankind existed in the same relationship to the cosmic father. Let's say that an infant or a small child existed in relationship to his or her own father. And that's a reasonable critique, I would say, to some degree, but it does, and this was purposeful, it does imply, more than imply in Freud's case, that people who adopt a religious belief that has a personified figure as at its apex are essentially acting out the role of dependent children. And I thought about that critique for a long time, and believe me, that's been a powerful critique. One of the best books I ever read, called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, I think took that line of argumentation. It developed it as well as any book I've ever seen argue it. Becker tried to bring closer to Freudian psychoanalysis on religion, and he did a pretty wicked job of it. Like, I think the book is seriously flawed and wrong, but it's really a great book. Like, some books are wrong in really good ways, right? They make a powerful, powerful argument. They really take it to its extreme. I think Becker missed the point, and he missed it in the same way that Freud missed Jung's point, and Becker, who wrote this book on the psychology, the psychoanalysis of religion, never referred to Jung except very briefly in the introduction, and I think that was a major mistake. But Becker took the argument that the hypothesis of God is nothing but an attempt by human beings to recreate a quasi-infantile state of dependency and to be able to rely on an all-knowing Father and to thereby recover the comfort, perhaps, that we experienced when we were young and had a hypothetically all-knowing Father, for those of us who were lucky to have someone who vaguely resembled that. But the more I thought about that, the more that struck me as quite implausible across time. Charles Taylor, I think it was Charles Taylor, wrote an interesting book called The Origins of the Modern Self. He's a McGill philosopher, and I wouldn't necessarily call him a friend of classic religion, but it doesn't matter. He made a very interesting point about Christianity in particular. He said, well, if you're going to invent a religion that offered you nothing but infantile comfort, why in the world would you bother with conceptualizing hell? That just seems like an unnecessary detail to add to the whole story, right? If it's all about comfort, why would you hypothesize that the consequence of a serious error was eternal torment? That doesn't really sound it isn't the sort of thing that is likely to make you feel comfortable. James Joyce, when he wrote about that, said he had terrible nightmares when he was a child because of the hellfire sermons the Jesuits used to spew forth, let's say. And he wrote down what he remembered of them, and they were pretty hair-raising. I think in James Joyce's book, I think it was Portrait of the Artist of a Young Man, he talked about the Jesuits telling him that hell was a prison with walls that were 7 miles thick, that was always in darkness and consumed by fire, and that the people who were trapped there were continually burnt by this dark fire that gave them light, which also simultaneously rejuvenated their flesh so that it could be burnt off eternally. In case you were wondering how it was going to be burnt off eternally, that's apparently the process. It's not easy for me to see that as an infantile wish fulfillment, I'm afraid. You could be a cynic about it, and Elaine Cadgels, who wrote a book on the devil, was cynical about it in this manner. She thought that the Christians, so to speak, invented hell as a place to put their enemies. And, fair enough, but no, that's not accurate, really, although it's convenient to have a place to put your enemies. Charles Taylor did point out, for example, that the modern terror of loss of self, let's say the existential loss of self and loss of meaning, was perhaps roughly paralleled by the medieval terror of hell, in terms of existential intensity. And so hell wasn't merely a place where those people that you didn't care for would end up. It was the place where you were going to go if you didn't walk the line properly.
There you go.
I don't think Freud's critique really holds water in the final analysis. And then Marx's critique, of course, was that religion was the opiate of the masses. And he made an argument that was similar to Freud's, although somewhat earlier, and based upon the presupposition that religious beliefs were stories told to the gullible masses in order to keep them pacified and happy while their corporate overlords, for lack of a better purpose, continued to exploit them and weaken them. And I find the critique of human institutions as driven entirely by power very, let's say, questionable to say the least. And of course, every human institution is corrupt for one reason or another, and it's also corrupt specifically by such things as deception and arrogance and the demand for unearned power. And the same thing, of course, can be applied to religious systems, but that doesn't mean that they are in some special way characteristic of those faults. And maybe you think they are, and maybe you can make a case for it, but it's not prima facie, I think that's how you say that, evident that also is a particularly useful criticism. I don't buy it. I think that's far too cynical. I think that the people who wrote these stories, first of all, what are you going to do? You're going to run a bloody conspiracy for 3,000 years successfully? Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Run a conspiracy for 15 minutes without somebody ratting you out. It's impossible. So whatever's at the basis of the construction, not only of these stories, but of the dogmatic structures that emerged from them, I think that it's a terrible mistake to reduce them to unidimensional explanations. In fact, I generally think that reducing any complex human behavior to a unidimensional explanation is often the sign of a seriously limited thinker. And, you know, I say that with some caution because Freud did do that with religion, at least to some degree, and Freud was a serious thinker. Marx, I suppose, was a serious thinker too, even though, well, yeah, he's someone you just, if you have any sense, Marx just leaves you speechless. So anyway, so that's all to say that I don't think there's any simple explanation for how these stories have the power that they have. I really don't. I don't think you can reduce it to political conspiracy, that's for sure. I don't think you can reduce it to psychological infantilism. I think you can make a case, like I have, that they are repositories of the collective wisdom of the human race.
Yes.
I had an interesting letter this week from someone. I get a lot of interesting letters. I think I'm going to make an archive out of them and put them on the web at some point, with people's permission, obviously. And he said that he'd be following my lectures and noted that I'd be making what you might describe as a quasi-biological or evolutionary case for the emergence of the information that the stories contain. And he said, well, how do you know that someone from a different religious tradition or speaking of a different religious tradition couldn't do exactly the same thing? And I thought, well, first of all, to some degree they could, because there is overlap. Like I've talked to you a little bit about Taoism, for example, and the Taoist view of being as, you know, the eternal balance between chaos and order. One thing I didn't tell you, I don't think about that, and I don't know if you know this, but there's a neuropsychologist named Elkonin Goldberg, who was a student of Alexander Luria. And Luria was, I think, the greatest neuropsychologist of the 20th century. He was a Russian. And he was one of the first people to really determine, in large part, the function of the frontal cortex, which was quite a mystery for a very long period of time. And Goldberg, you know how we have two hemispheres, right? We have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And people often think of the left for right-handed people, right-handed males more particularly, because women are more neurologically diffuse. It's one of the things that makes them more robust to head injury, for example. And maybe men are less diffuse and somewhat more specialized, which makes them a bit more specialized, but a little more subject to damage. Anyways, we have two hemispheres, left and the right, and no one exactly knows why. And we know that they house quasi-independent consciousnesses, because if you divide the corpus callosum that unites them, which was done in cases of intractable epilepsy, for example, that each hemisphere is capable of developing its own consciousness to some degree, the right generally nonverbal and the left verbal. And so there has been this idea that the left is a verbal hemisphere and the right is a nonverbal hemisphere. But that can't be right, because of course animals don't talk and they have a bifurcated hemisphere. So if it's right, it's not causally right. Now Goldberg hypothesized instead that the hemispheres were specialized for routinization and non-routinization, or for novelty and familiarity, or for chaos and order. And so that's pretty damn cool. When I ran across that, I also thought about that as a signal of what we call it multi-method, multi-trait construct validation, because I never thought of the hemispheres as operating that way, and Goldberg came up with this in a historical pathway that was entirely independent from any mythologically inspired thinking, completely independent. In fact, it was motivated more by materialist Russian neuropsychology, which was materialist for political reasons and also for scientific reasons. But the idea is that we have one hemisphere that reacts very rapidly to things we don't know, and it's more imaginative and diffuse, and it's associated more with negative emotion, because negative emotion is what you should feel immediately when you encounter something you don't understand. Because it's a form of thinking, right? Negative emotion. It's like, I'm someone.
Speaking of negative emotion, oh my goodness. Thank you, Shaman, for loving my show. And thank you, Mantis, for loving my show. My numbers keep bouncing around all over the place. And so 2 seconds ago, it said that there was one person. Now it says that there are 5 people. And I'm very, very confused by this. I don't know if YouTube is screwing with my numbers here. So, but anyway, thank you everybody so much for listening. I got to stay out of these numbers because they're driving me crazy. But yeah, so negative emotion. Let's get back into it.
Where things aren't what they should be. right hemisphere does that, generates images very rapidly to help you figure out what might be there. And then the left hemisphere takes that and develops it into something that's more articulated and algorithmic and fully understood. And so then there's this dynamic balance between the right and the left hemisphere, where the left tries to impose order on the world. That's Ramachandran, who's a neurologist in California, a very famous neurologist, who also developed a theory like Goldberg's, who said that the left hemisphere imposes routinized order on the world, and the right hemisphere generates novelty and reacts to novelty and generates novel hypotheses. And he thought, and there's some good evidence for this, that's what's happening during the dream, is that information is moved from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere in small doses, basically, so that the novel revelations of the right hemisphere don't demolish the algorithmic structures that the left hemisphere has so carefully put together.
And there's, I think he was talking about, or he may talk about in a second, there's this woman who has a stroke. And it's a TED Talk called A Stroke of Insight, where she talks about, she's a neuroscientist, a neurobiologist, neurologist, something like that. And she has a stroke and she loses one hemisphere of her brain. And she stops being able to make sense of numbers and things like that. And she has this wonderful spiritual experience as a result of it, where she can't tell the difference between the molecules in her arm and the molecules in the wall as she's trying to hold herself up. And it just becomes this wonderful sort of like euphoric acid trip and stuff like that. So listening mantis, thank you. Doing this all week. Good to know, because I can't let the numbers get to me, because yeah, it's obviously artificial. But getting back to the left and right hemisphere thing, and it's called A Stroke of Insight. That's the TED Talk. Samantha tiptoes in. Gotcha. You get to sit in the front. So it's all right that you were late. Just know that there was a little e-begging going on, and I'll go ahead and I'll put that banner back up, because I have been told that I need to e-beg by my mother. So here's my Cash App, and anything that you guys can provide, and then write this down. I'm not approved yet, but there's my subscribe star. So I'll go ahead and leave that. Well, no, I'm going to take those down because I hate e-begging. But anyway, yeah, they're off here too. The YouTube gremlins meeting chaos. Yeah. Well, YouTube gremlins. Anyway, the left and the right hemisphere, that's one of the things that is used in EMDR, where they use bilateral stimulation, and it can be either a light bar that goes back and forth. It's the old swinging watch. And you can also do tappers where they buzz in each hand, bzz, 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 and it stimulates both sides of your brain at the same time, so that you leave this semi-trance, you reach this semi-trance stage that allows you to process things without reliving them. They've learned that talk therapy, you're actually just laying down, each time you tell the story, you're just making the grooves, the traumatic grooves, deeper and deeper and deeper. But if you do it with bilateral stimulation, it doesn't do that. And so you're actually able to revisit the situation without reliving it, without putting down those neural pathways. Oh, Samantha, I don't think it's the streaming from the other folks. I don't think it's the split possibility. I've seen the numbers, like people are commenting in the room, and the comments are off from the numbers that are showing on the screen and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't think it's competition right now. I think it's actually what people have said in here, that YouTube is screwing with the numbers. But that's one of the things about why meditation is important, is to silence that left side of your brain that's constantly trying to put order on things, and you let the dreamlike qualities of the right side of your brain come up, and that's like where your intuition comes up. Yeah, it is weird. It's very weird. So people have been watching it and noticing it on here. So yeah, very bizarre things going on tonight in YouTube land. But yeah, dream is the left and the right hemisphere, basically playing ping pong with your thoughts and ordering things, between your intuition and your creativity. Yeah, or your intuition and your creativity with your order, structure, building part of the brain. That's why a lot of times, images will come through that don't really make sense or do make sense in the dream world, but don't make sense or do make sense in the waking world. Oh, I wasn't actually, dealing with my mother as a flower. It's because, I have this emotional reactivity and I pictured her as a flower because of this sort of gardening thing they were doing in the nurturing and the brain is just a funny place, and it's very, very cool. So let's get back to it.
So and I like that theory too, because it also does help justify the hypothesis that I've been laying out for you, which is that there's part of us that extends ourselves out into the world and tries to understand what we don't know, and that part extends itself out with behavior and also with emotion and also with image, and maybe with poetry, and then maybe with storytelling, and then as that develops, then we develop more and more articulated representations of that emergent knowledge, and so you can map that quite nicely onto the neurologists and the neuropsychologists' presumption about what constitutes the reason for the hemispheric differentiation. But the other thing that's so cool about the hemispheric differentiation argument, as far as I'm concerned, and this is worth thinking about, man, because it's a word that Ned Flanders uses for that. Noggin scratcher? I think it's something like that. Anyways, we do make the assumption that what it is that we are biologically adapted to is reality, right? It's actually an axiomatic definition if you're a Darwinian, because nature is what selects. By definition, that's what nature is. It's what selects. And if the nature that selects has forced upon you a dual hemispheric structure because half of you has to deal with chaos and half of you has to deal with order, then you can make a pretty damn strong inferential case that the world is made out of chaos and order.
Yeah.
And that's really something to think about, man, So you can think about that for a while if you want. So anyways, for whatever reason, there is a lot packed into these stories. And so let's investigate a couple more of them. We'll start with this story of Adam and Eve. Now, you may remember that the Bible is a series of books. Bible actually means something akin to library, and these books are written by all sorts of different people and groups of people and groups of editors and groups of people who edited over and over across very, very large periods of time. So they're authored by no one and many at the same time.
Out of many
There
one.
was a tradition for a long time that the earliest books were written by Moses, but that's probably not technically correct, even though it might be dramatically correct, let's say, or correct in the way that a fairy tale is correct. And I'm not trying to put down fairy tale by saying that. There's a number of authors, and the way the authors have been identified tentatively is by certain stylistic commonalities across the different stories, different uses of words, like the words for God, different poetic styles, different topics, and so forth. And people have been working for probably 200 years, roughly that, to try to sort out who wrote what and how that was all cobbled together. But it doesn't really matter for our purposes. What matters is that it's an aggregation of collected narrative traditions, and maybe you could say it's an aggregation of collected narrative wisdom. We don't have to go that far, but we can at least say it's aggregated narrative traditions, and that there was some reason that those traditions and not others were kept, and that there were some reasons, complex though they may have been, why they were sequenced in the order that they were sequenced. Because one of the things that's really remarkable about the Bible as a document is that it actually has a plot, and that's really something. I mean, it's sprawling and it goes many places, but the fact that something's been cobbled together over several thousand years, maybe 4,000 years, maybe longer than that if you include the oral traditions that preceded it, and God only knows how old those are.
Right.
The collective imagination, part of the human collective imagination has cobbled together a library with a plot. And like I see the Bible as an attempt, a collective attempt by humanity to solve the deepest problems that we have. And
Yes.
I think those problems are the problems of, primarily the problem of self-consciousness. The fact that not only are we mortal and that we die, but that we know it. And that's the unique predicament of human beings. And it makes all the difference. And I think that's laid out in Adam and Eve, in the story of Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
The reason that makes us unique is laid out in that story. And interestingly, I really realized this only after I was doing the last 3 lectures. So the Bible presents a cataclysm at the beginning of the time, which is the emergence of self-consciousness in human beings, which puts a rift into the structure of being. That's the right way to think about it. And that's really given cosmic significance. Now, you can dispense with that and say, well, nothing that happens to human beings is of cosmic significance because we're these short-lived, mold-like entities that are like cancers on this tiny little planet that's rotating out in the middle of nowhere on the edge of some unknown galaxy in the middle of infinite space, and nothing that happens to us matters. And it's fine. Like, you can walk down that road if you want. I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's part of the reason I think that for all intents and purposes, it's untrue.
Right.
It isn't a road you can walk down and live well.
Yeah.
In fact, I think if you really walk down that road and you really take it seriously, you end up not living at all.
Yes,
So
exactly.
Certainly very reminiscent. I mean, I've talked to lots of people who are suicidal and seriously suicidal, and the kind of conclusions that they draw about the utility of life prior to wishing for its cessation are very much like the kind of conclusions that you draw if you walk down that particular line of reasoning long enough. If you're interested in that, you could read Tolstoy's Confessions, Leo Tolstoy's Confession. It's a very short book. It's a killer, man. It's a powerful book, very, very short. And Tolstoy describes his obsession with suicide when he was at the height of his fame. Most well-known author in the world, huge family, international fame, wealth beyond anyone's imagining at that time, influential, admired. He had everything that you could possibly imagine that everyone could have. And for years, he was afraid to go out into his barn with a rope or a gun because he thought he'd either hang himself or shoot himself. And he did get out of that. And he describes why that happened and where he went when that happened. So if you're interested.
I've been in that spot before because of a medication, and I was on way too much of this stuff, which they later found out does make people suicidal. And I told my husband, hide the guns, because one part of my brain was like, oh my gosh, my life is miserable, everything's meaningless, blah, blah, blah. I mean, just all the worst thoughts in the world that you could have. I'm a worthless wretch, da 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 da. And the other part of my brain was going, what are you doing? And so I told my husband, hide the guns. I cannot know where they are. Hide the guns. So yeah, I've been in that space and I know what it's like. So I understand avoiding the barn and rope and all of that.
That's a very good book. So the biblical stories, and starting with Adam and Eve, they present a different story. They present the emergence of self-consciousness in human beings as a cosmically cataclysmic event.
Yes.
And you could say, well, what do we have to do with the cosmos? And the answer to that is it depends on what you think consciousness has to do with the cosmos. And perhaps it's nothing, and perhaps it's everything.
Yes.
I'm going to go with everything because that's how it looks to me. Now, of course, anyone who wishes to is welcome to disagree. But if you believe that consciousness is a force of cosmic significance, which being itself is dependent on in any real sense, at least in any experience.
Well, now, how is consciousness not of cosmic importance when what other creature on the planet is investigating the cosmos? We're the only ones setting up satellite. We're the only ones who've created space trash, for goodness sake. So to say that there is of no cosmic importance when we're actually infecting, yes, partially infecting, but also infesting, the cosmos, with our technology and everything like that. So, yeah. Um, yes, consciousness has cosmic importance. Period. Period.
Experiential sense that it's not unreasonable to assume that radical restructurings of consciousness can worthily be granted some kind of cosmic or metaphysical significance. And even if it's not true from outside the human perspective, whatever that might be, it's bloody well true from within the human perspective, that's for sure. And so that's the initial event, in some sense, after the creation, is the cataclysmic fall. And then the entire rest of the Bible is an attempt to figure out what the hell to do about that. And everything in it is, and so you could say, for example, in the earliest, in the Old Testament stories, what seems to happen is that the state of Israel is founded, and it rises and falls and rises and falls. And so there's this experimentation for centuries, millennia even,
Yeah.
the idea that the way that you protect yourself against the tragic consequences of self-consciousness is by organizing yourself into a state. But then what happens is the state itself begins to reveal its pathologies. And as those pathologies mount, the state becomes unstable and collapses, and then it rises back up and becomes unstable and collapses, and then it rises back up.
Not just that the state becomes unstable, because Peterson is kind of forgetting some of the reasons why Israel collapsed. And one of those is a famine. I mean, if you look at the story of Joseph, and he's sold into slavery by his brothers, and later, is able to rise up as a seer because he's appointed by the king, because he can interpret dreams and stuff like that. It was a famine that caused the state to collapse. It was not necessarily just the pathologies of the state that caused it to collapse. Later it was, when you get into Lamentations, it was the pathologies of the state that caused it to collapse. But outside forces as well can cause it to collapse. So
after it does this a number of times, this is primarily from Northrop Frye's interpretations, people start wondering if there's not something wrong with the idea that the state itself is the pathway, is the place of redemption. That there's something wrong with that idea. And so then I think on the heels of that comes the Christian Revolution with its hypothesis that it's not the state that's the place of salvation, it's the individual psyche. And then there's an ethic that goes along with that too, which is quite interesting. So the ethic of redemption, after the state experiment fails, let's say, is that it's within the individual that redemption can be manifested, let's say. And even insofar as the state is concerned, because the state's proper functioning is dependent on the proper functioning of the individual, rather than the reverse, most fundamentally. And that the proper mode of individual being that's redemptive is truth. And truth is the antidote to the suffering that emerges with the fall of man in the story of Adam and Eve. And then that relates back to the chapters that we've already talked about, because there's this insistence in Genesis 1 that it's the word in the form of truth that generates order out of chaos. But even more importantly, and this is something like I said, I most clearly realized just doing these lectures for the last 3 weeks, is God continues to say, as he speaks order into being with truth, that the being he speaks into being is good.
now also remember, what is one of the first things that Adam does when they discover the knowledge of good and evil? He lies to God. Why are you hiding? I'm ashamed. I've run away from you. Why? Well, the woman made me do it. And we'll get to that. But it's very interesting that truth is so fundamental to all of these things. There's constantly the idea of truth being, what is redemptive and what saves us and everything like that. So we're getting into some really good stuff. This is getting into the meat of it, folks.
And so there's this insistence that the being that spoke into being through truth is good. And so there's a hint there. It's so interesting. There's a hint there right at the beginning of the story that the state of being that Adam and Eve inhabited before they fell, before they became conscious, insofar as they were made in the image of God and acting out the truth, that being itself was properly balanced.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes the entire Bible to rediscover that, which is a journey back to the beginning, right? And that's a classic theme. It's a classic
amazing
theme that the wise person is the person who finds what they lost in childhood and regains it.
Yes.
So I think that's a Jewish idea, that Zadok, if I remember correctly, who's a Messiah figure, is the person who finds what he lost in childhood and regains it. This idea of this return to the beginning, except that the return is you don't fall backwards into childhood and unconsciousness. You return voluntarily to the state of childhood, well awake, and then determined to participate through truth in the manifestation of proper being. Now, I'm a psychologist, and I've taught personality theory for a very long time, and I know personality theories, but profound personality theories pretty well, and I'm reasonably well versed in philosophy, although not as well versed as I should be. But I can tell you, in all the things I've ever read or encountered or thought about, I have never once found an idea that matches that in terms of profundity, but not only profundity, also in believability. Because the other thing I see as a clinician, and I think this is very characteristic of clinical experience, and also very much described explicitly by the great clinicians, is that what cures in therapy is truth.
Yes.
That's the curative. Now, there's exposure to the things you're afraid of and avoiding as well, but I would say that's a form of enacted truth, because if you know there's something you should do by your own set of rules, and you're avoiding it, and you're enacting a lot, you're not telling one, but you're acting one out. It's the same damn thing. So if I can get you to face what it is that you're confronting that you know you shouldn't be avoiding, then what's happening is that we're both partaking in the process of attempting you to act out your deepest truth. And what happens is that improves people's lives, and it improves them radically. And the clinical evidence for that is overwhelming. We know that if you expose people to the things they're afraid of, but that they're avoiding, they get better.
Yes.
You have to do it carefully and cautiously and with their own participation and all of that. But of all the things that clinicians have established that's credible, that's number one. And that's nested inside this deeper realization that the clinical experience is redemptive, let's say, because it's designed to address suffering, insofar as the people who are engaged in the process are both telling each other the truth. And then you think, well, obviously, because if you have some problems and you come to talk to me about them, well, first of all, just by coming to talk to me about them, you've admitted that they exist. Man, that's a pretty good start. And second, well, if you tell me about them, then we know what they are. And then if we know what they are, we can maybe start to lay out some solutions, and then you can go act out the solutions and see if they work. But if you don't admit they're there and you won't tell me what they are, and I don't, and I'm like posturing and acting egotistically and taking the upper hand and all of that in our discussions, well, how the hell is that going to work?
Lemon Pepper makes an interesting comment. Thought Jordan Peterson was an atheist. Jordan Peterson doesn't believe in atheists. He doesn't believe that atheism is actually a thing. And for the longest time, he was very cagey about his Christianity. But since having his illness and recovering from it, and his wife's illness and her recovering from it, he's come out 100% as a Christian. But there's a whole thing on belief and knowing and all of that. But in his talks with Sam Harris, he makes it very clear that he doesn't believe that anybody is an atheist, because in order to be able to live, you have to have faith in things. And that, the very notion that we all operate on faith and belief and all these other things makes it impossible to be an atheist. It may not necessarily mean that you are a Christian, but for him, what he was raised in, yes, it's Jordan Peterson has never been an atheist and doesn't even believe that the concept is possible. So if you ever have a chance to listen to his talks, debates with Sam Harris, with Dave Rubin moderating, they're absolutely fascinating and hysterical at the same time. So, and also some of his talks from Australia talking about how atheism is kind of impossible. They're very interesting talks. But yeah, Jordan Peterson is definitely he wasn't, when he did this series, he wasn't out as a Christian, and I don't think he was so strongly rooted in his Christian faith. But now his recovery from his wife's near-death experience and his own near-death experience from various illnesses and everything like that, yes, he's definitely a Christian. So
it might be comfortable moment to moment while we stay encapsulated in our delusion, but it's not going to work. So a lot of that seems, if you think it through, it seems pretty self-evident. And, Freud thought that repression was at the heart of much mental suffering. The difference between repression and deception is a matter of degree, and that's all. It's technical. It's a technical differentiation. And Alfred Adler, who was one of Freud's greatest associates, let's say, and much underappreciated, I would say, he thought that people got into problems because they started to act out a life lie. That's what he called it, a life lie. That's worth looking up, because Adler, although not as charismatic as Freud, was very practical and really foreshadowed a lot of later developments in cybernetic theory. And of course, Jung believed that you could bypass psychotherapy entirely by merely making a proper moral effort in your own life.
So to address this, Lemon Pepper, agnostic and atheist are two different things. He was, I don't even think he was agnostic, but he didn't like being placed in a box, and he didn't like being placed on the binary side of one argument or another. So yeah, there is that great song of his, I act as if God exists, and all of that. But the more you listen to Jordan Peterson, the more you realize that he was just a closet Christian before, and now he's full on out of the closet. So yeah, Samantha's got it. I think he was just not as open about it as he speaks on this, and says that these always moved through the world as if there was a God, but he didn't know if there is. She says, still to this day, when people ask him, do you believe in God? He does not say yes. He says, actually, since then he has. If you look at his talks since coming back during his, he started doing broadcasts again with his daughter, Michaela Peterson. And he's come out full on and thanked people for their prayers, and talks about his Christian faith, and he says his Christian faith. So he's come out to this, he's come out of the closet as a Christian. So yeah, but at this time he was a lot more cagey. He was a lot more, not willing to commit.
Carl Rogers believed that it was honest communication mediated through dialogue that had redemptive consequences, and the behaviorists believe that you do a careful microanalysis of the problems that are laid before you and help introduce people to what they're avoiding. It's like all of those things to me are just secular variations of the notion that truth will set you free, essentially.
Yes.
So it's a pretty powerful story. And
interesting that we would be talking about the truth setting you free.
The other thing is you dispense with it at your peril, because what I have seen as well is that the people that I've seen who've been really hurt have been hurt mostly by deceit. And that's also worth thinking about, that, you get walloped by life. There's no doubt about that. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
And he was.
I thought for a long time that maybe people can handle earthquakes and cancer and even death, maybe, but they can't handle betrayal, and they can't handle deception. They can't
Very
handle
true.
having the rug pulled out from underneath them by people that they love and trust. That just does them in.
Yep.
It makes them ill, but it doesn't work. It hurts them psychophysiologically. It damages them. But more than that,
Breaks
it makes
your
them
heart.
cynical and bitter and vicious and resentful.
Yep.
And then they also start to act all that out in the world, and that makes it worse.
Yes.
So the story starts, God uses the spoken truth to create being that is good. And then the cataclysm occurs. And then human beings spend untold millennia trying to sort out exactly what to do about the fact that they've become self-conscious. And, by the way, we have, right? We are, in fact, self-conscious. No other animal has that distinction. Now,
Yes.
you'll read that chimpanzees can, for example, if you put lipstick on a chimpanzee, it's kind of a strange thing to do. Yeah. Well, I won't pursue that any further. But the chimpanzee will wipe off the lipstick if you show it a mirror. And dolphins seem to be able to recognize themselves in mirrors. And there is the glimmerings of self-conscious recognition in other animals. But
his rehab wasn't the type of rehab that everybody talks about rehab. His rehab was for a physiological dependence. It wasn't for an addiction. He wasn't misusing the medication. There's a lot of people who a lot of press articles who have talked about this. He was having withdrawals that could not, he tried to go off the medication himself. And the reaction he had to it was so terrible that he tried taking the medication again. That caused an allergic reaction. And I've gone through this myself with medications that I've used for migraines and things like that. And they weren't opiates. They weren't even benzos or anything like that. They were actually, non-addictive substances. But this kind of thing can happen. He tried to go off the medication himself. He was physically unable to do it because of the withdrawal symptoms that happened. And they now know that he has permanent nerve damage because of this medication. And that's what he was experiencing when he came off of the medication. It made him shake and move uncontrollably, which I've had the same experience with gabapentin. If I run short on my gabapentin and I have to start rationing myself, I get agitated and I have to move and I can't sit still and I'll jostle my legs and things like that, which I actually have a residual of that going on because recently I had the pharmacy, everybody got sick in the pharmacy. There were no pharmacists. I couldn't fill my medication because there were no pharmacists. So I started tapering myself. And as I did, I started getting these physical side effects from the taper. And so I was able to, not go off of it completely and just taper back up once the pharmacists came back. But what happened with Jordan Peterson is he was actually trying to quit the medication. And when he did, he started having those physical withdrawal symptoms. And then when he tried to go back on the medication, he had an allergic reaction to it, which then put him in the hospital. And then they had to do a medical taper off of that. And then as a result of trying to do the medical taper, because they couldn't do it in Canada, because it was something that happened so suddenly, so he had to do it in the United States, and the United States didn't have really a good program. So then they flew to, I think it was either Russia or one of those Eastern European countries. And while he was going through that rehab, he got pneumonia. That nearly killed him. And so he's been slowly, trying to crawl back from that. So that it was a different kind of rehab. It wasn't like addiction rehab, which is what a lot of the papers reported. So yeah, Shaman said, side effect complications. Oh my gosh, they can be brutal. So yeah, he's got a permanent condition now in his nerves. And I can't remember the name of it, but Michaela Peterson talks about it. He doesn't say, yes, I know there is a God, but what he has done is he has come out of the closet and said, yes, I am a Christian. So that's different. Well, never mind. If you know exactly what I'm talking about. So sorry, just to fill everybody else in. It is still rehab at the end of the day. And I know you're not trying to insult him. You would never do anything like that, Samantha. I know that. But a lot of people in the media did. And so a lot of people have been left with this, idea that he became an addict and fell from grace and all this other stuff. And it's like, trying to get people to sort out the truth from the lies. So I thought, just for the sake of everybody or anybody watching this later to understand what's going on. Addiction does come in different forms, but this wasn't an addiction thing. This was definitely a medical problem that because the stress was gone in his life. He was put on this medication for his wife's cancer because she almost died. And, he was raised with this woman and had known her all her life, was the love of his life ever since he was a small child. I mean, we're talking less than 10 years old. He knew that he was going to marry her and loved her. And, so she was dying. He went on this medication to deal with that stress because they were also on the book tour at the time. And so, it wasn't an addiction at all. He was just trying to come off of the medication because the stress had passed and he didn't need the medication anymore. And then wham, he gets walloped by, these medical problems. We have it on Black Label in the United States because we know that this happens with this medication. It was an extended release of benzodiazepines. We know how dangerous it is in the United States. They didn't have that warning on it in the medication for Canada. So that's where he got hung up on that. And it was terrible. And I also feel for him. I mean, my heart goes out to his whole family, but thank God he's on the mend. So, I know you're not saying that he was abusing it, Samantha. And that, but yeah, it did take him forever and it needed a medical taper for him. They even had to put him in a chemically induced coma at one point to be able to deal with it. I mean, so this was a hardcore taper, the way that he came off of it. And he's been left with permanent nerve damage as a result, so it's not like, yeah, I mean, the poor man has been through hell and back, literally, quite literally. So, yeah. It's one hell of a thing. So I know you weren't saying that he was addicted, Samantha, but a lot of people in the press were. And so I want everybody to be absolutely clear on that distinction, and that is not what happened to Jordan. So, or Dr. Peterson, I should say. I should give him a little bit more respect, but he feels like a stepdad to me or something like that. So, anyway, but thank you for clearing that up. And yeah, as a result of going through all of that, nearly dying and coming back, he has come out as a Christian. He hasn't come out and said, I believe in God, but he has, decided that he's going to come out of the closet as a Christian. So, don't think it's falling for grace. All I think that it humanizes him, actually. Yeah. No, I think it humanizes him very much so. But, in a lot of people were leaving really nasty comments on his videos about how Jordan's a shill because he doesn't practice what he preaches, because he became an addict and fell from grace and wasn't following his own rules and this, that, and the other. So I had a big, long argument with somebody online who misunderstood this whole thing a couple of months ago. And I was like, no, you got it. You've been tricked by fake news. So, oh my gosh, it was a hell of a thing. So, but yeah, I mean, that guy was actually very happy to find out that he had been tricked and that it wasn't addiction rehab. It was a physical rehab. So yeah. But the poor man, I mean, he's for a while there, he really was a shell of his former self, but I think he's on the road to recovery now. So anyway, with all of that, thank you for listening to all of that. The full, novel length explanation. Here we go.
Put that in the same conceptual category as human self-consciousness is, to my way of thinking. It's well, it's uninformed to say the least, but I also think that it's motivated. It's motivated by a kind of anti-humanistic underlying motivation, because our self-consciousness is so incredibly developed compared to that there hardly any distinct conceptual universe. It's like comparing the alarm cries of vervet monkeys when they see a predator to the language of human beings. Yeah, there's some similarities, man. There are utterances, and there are utterances with meaning, but they're not language. And the self-consciousness of animals is proto-self-consciousness, and it's only there in a very small number of animals. And it's nothing like ours. They're not aware of the future like we are. They're not aware of their boundaries in space and time. And that's the critical thing. And most particularly time. Human beings discovered time. And when we discovered time, we discovered the end of each of our being. And that made all the difference. And that's what the story of Adam and Eve is about. So Genesis 1 is derived from the priestly source, where God is known as Elohim or El Shaddai. And there's God in the singular, and there's gods in the plural. And I suppose that's because it seems that if you analyze the history of the development of monotheistic ideas, that monotheism emerges out of a plurality of gods. And as I mentioned, I think it's because the gods represent fundamental forces at minimum, and those fundamental forces have to be hierarchically organized with something absolute at the top, because otherwise they do nothing but war, right? You have to organize your values hierarchically or you stay confused. And that's true if you're an individual, and it's true if you're a state. If you don't know what the next thing you should do is, then there's 50 things you should do. And then how are you going to do any of them? You can't. You have to prioritize. Something has to be above something else. It has to be arranged in a hierarchy for it not to be chaotic. And so there's some principle at the top of the hierarchy, and maybe the organization of the gods over time. That's the battle of gods that Mircea Eliade had talked about. And if you're interested in that, you could read A History of Religious Ideas, which I would really recommend. It's a 3-volume book. It's actually quite a straightforward read as far as these things go. And Eliade does a very nice job of describing how and even why polytheism tends towards monotheism. Even in polytheistic cultures, there's a strong tendency for the gods to organize themselves in a hierarchy with one god at the top. In a monotheistic culture, in some sense, all the other gods just disappear across time, and there's nothing left but the top god. But even in a polytheistic society, there's a hierarchy of power among the gods. The first story is newer than the second one, so the story I'm going to tell you today is actually older than the one I already told you, even though their order was flipped by the redactor, who's the hypothetical person or persons who edited these stories together. We don't know exactly why he or the committee, or what I suspect it was a single person, but who knows. We don't know why the stories were edited together in the order that they were edited together, but we could infer, they were edited together in that order because the editor thought they made sense that way, because that's what an editor does, right? An editor tends to take diverse ideas and then to organize them in some manner that makes sense. And part of the manner that makes sense is that you can tell them to people and the people stay interested, and you can tell them to people and people remember them. That's one of the ways you can tell if you've got an argument right, because it's communicable and understandable and memorable. And so this person was, let's say, motivated by intuition to organize the stories in this particular manner. So the Yahwist strand contains the stories, the classic stories in the Pentateuch. That's 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which we'll try to get through perhaps in these 12 lectures. We'll see how that goes. It's strongly anthropomorphic. So the God in the Yahwist account is, for all intents and purposes, a sort of meta person. And I dealt with that a little bit last week, because people tend to, think of that as unsophisticated. But when you think that the mind, the ground of consciousness, is the most complex thing that we know of, then it's not so unsophisticated to assume that the most complex thing that there might be is like that, or at least it's as good as we can do with our imaginations. And so I don't think it's so unsophisticated. It's also the case, and this is practically speaking, is that it is not at all unreasonable to think of God the Father as the spirit that arises from the crowd that exists into the future, right? And we talked about that in relationship to the idea of sacrifice, at least a little bit, or we're going to. You make sacrifices in the present so that the future is happy with you.
Yes.
question is, what is that future that would be happy with you? And the answer to that is, it's the spirit of humanity. That's who you're negotiating with, because you make the assumption that if you forego impulsive pleasure and get your medical degree, that when you're done in 10 years and you're a physician, humanity as such will honor your sacrifice and commitment and open the doors to you, right? So,
and it's not just that, it's, you know, you in the future, will you honor yourself if you make these sacrifices? You know, if I'm lazy and self-indulgent and I don't do any work and I, you know, let my house and everything fall to pieces and everything like that, I live with regrets, you know. Me not being able to take care of my teeth, I'm living with regret right now. And, you know, having to get all this very expensive work done and things like that, you know, you can, it's what is it? A penny saved is a pound earned or something like that. Where if I just do a little bit of maintenance, very inexpensive maintenance, both in the terms of time and effort and everything like that, if I just do a little bit of everything over time, that saves me having big costs that I have to pay down the line. And now the doggos want to come back in. So these are also, it opens up the doors to yourself, but we'll go back to Jordan now.
So you're treating the future as if it's a single being, and you're also treating it as if it's something like a compassionate judge. You're acting that out. And maybe we had to imagine God in that form before we could understand. Once we started to understand that there was a future, perhaps we had to imagine God in that form in order to concretize something that we could bargain with, so that we could figure out how to use sacrifice to figure out how to guide ourselves into the future. Because a sacrifice is a contract with the future, but it's not a contract with any particular person. It's a contract with the spirit of humanity as such. It's something like that. And so when you think about it that way, that should make you faint with amazement, because that is such a bloody amazing idea. If you come up with that idea that you can bargain with the future, that is some idea, man. That's like the major idea of humankind. We suffer. What do we do about it? We figure out how to bargain with the future, and we minimize suffering in that manner.
Exactly.
Like no other animal does that either. You know, like lions, they just eat everything. I think a wolf can eat 40 pounds of meat in a single sitting, right? It's like there's some meat, eat it. It's like not like save some mammoth for tomorrow.
That's actually not true. This is something that I've learned in doing a lot of nature program on wolves. Wolves and dogs will eat until their bellies are distended. And wolves actually do save food for tomorrow, but they don't have any hands to carry it with. So they eat all the meat that they can see until they're absolutely stuffed. They walk back to the den, they throw up at their den, and then they bury it and save it for later. That's why dogs will bury bones and stuff like that. My dog will bury what I call pizza bones. She used to do this before Sam was around, you know, because Sam would dig them up. But she would bury the crusts of pizza that I would give her all out in the yard and things like that. And she'd dig them up a year later after they had fermented and gotten all these really nice, you know, bacteria and stuff on there that's actually good for doggies' digestions. And then she'd, you know, eat the pizza bones a year later. So this is why wolves, and they do actually save for tomorrow. There are a lot of animals that save for tomorrow. Some monkeys will save for tomorrow. Squirrels obviously save for tomorrow and stuff like that. But he is right in a general sense. But other animals do bargain with the future, and you know, it can't be that we're unique in that sense and the only animals that do that, because evolutionarily speaking, you know, other species had to come up with this as well for it to be, you know, something that we developed along the way. You know, Neanderthals obviously did too. There's just not around anymore to tell the stories about it. So, but yeah, every once in a while Peterson gets something wrong, and this is one of the things he got wrong. So
that's not a wolf thing, man. That's a human thing, and that might mean you have to be hungry today, or maybe you're a farmer. You know, several thousand years ago, 6,000 years ago or so, when agriculture first got going, and you're starving to death. waiting for the spring planting, and you think we bloody well better not eat those seeds, right? And that's really something, to be able to control yourself, to make the future real, to put off what you could use today, and not just in some impulsive manner. Man, maybe your kids are starving to death. You think, we are not touching the seeds
Exactly.
for the future. And for human beings to have discovered that, and then to also have figured out that we could bargain with the future, it's like, man, that's something. And I think that the stories that are laid out in this book actually describe, at least in part, the process by which that occurred. The Yahweh stories begin with Genesis 2:4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth, wind. So there's two real creation stories at the beginning. The newer one, which is the first one, and the older one, which is the second one. And the older one begins in chapter 2, and that's the story that we are getting into now. Adam and Eve are in that. Cain and Abel, Noah, the Tower of Babel, in the Yahweh strand, Exodus, Numbers along, and there's some of the priestly version in there too, as well as the Ten Commandments. There's some lovely representations of paradise. This is
Hieronymus Bosch is on the.
Delights. What's his name? Say that. Bosch, yes, Hieronymus Bosch. Yes, crazy. I mean, how he didn't get burnt at the stake is absolutely beyond me. I mean, some of you know about Salvador Dali. I suppose most of you do. I mean, Dali's a piker compared to Hieronymus Bosch. Man, you could spend, because there's 3 pieces of this particular painting, you could spend a very bizarre and surreal month looking at that painting. I don't know what it was with Bosch, but he was some sort of creature that only popped up once, and probably for the best. And so there's been very many representations of paradise. I mean, God only knows what that is. It's like, you could probably guess, but I won't. And then look, I mean, that's the lion lying down with the lamb, right? So that's this idea that's maybe projected back in time, that there was a time, or maybe will be a time, when the horrors of life are no longer necessary for life itself to exist, right? And the horrors of life are, of course, that everything eats everything else, and that everything dies, and that everything's born, and that the whole bloody place is a charnel house, and it's a catastrophe from beginning to end. And this is the vision of it being other than that. And there's a strong idea. This is also implicit in the alchemical ideas, and I think it's also implicit in the scientific revolution, that human beings can interact with reality in such a way so that the tragic and evil elements of it can be mitigated, and so that we can move somewhat closer to a state that might be characterized, well, that's obviously imagistic, but it might be characterized by something like that, where we have the benefits of actual existence without all of the catastrophe that seems to go along with it.
I'm going to pause it there. Samantha, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. They'll bring you weird, random, shiny things that they find. They have made friends with you. And you should see some of the UW studies about crows. And ravens. They're absolutely amazing birds. And yes, they have bird funerals. Check out the studies out of the University of Washington on all of this. They recognize faces. So, they are also one of the few animals that uses tools, and they are so smart. They are so smart. Check out those UW studies, because they recognize faces, and if they're bringing you presents like that, they're literally bringing you presents. They're bargaining with you to say thank you, for doing this. So you've adopted wild birds, and I think that is so awesome. So I watch birds as well, and I've got a couple of bird feeders, and the squirrels know my yard, and the birds know my yard. Yep, you are a friend for life, Sam. You are their friend for life. So if you shoot a raven, they will avoid the entire flock. They talk to one another, and they will avoid your place if just one of them gets shot. So we do not understand them at all. They're one of the coolest, smartest birds out there. But here's I gotta add this from Justice. This might be weird, but I've had several friends pass away, and I've seen them fly right over my head and almost knock me over. Or another time, a hummingbird flew right up into my face and hovered. Yes, I've had hummingbirds do that too, where it just stood there looking at me. And also burrowing owls. We had gone way out into the desert where there were burrowing owls, and it was the first time they had encountered humans. And they just sat there circling us, looking at us, going, what are these weird creatures that are here? It was absolutely amazing. So Samantha says, they are a fascination. Yes, Pam. Oh, you've seen that study. Okay. New Caledonian crows. Yes, yes. They are so cool. They are so cool. Yeah, birds, that is. Birds do communicate. And they're such a cool animal, and we don't understand them. You know, to say somebody has a bird brain is actually a compliment, not an insult. But yeah, nature has been my savior many a times too. So I'm with you guys. I'm with all of you guys on that. But as I said, we are at the hour mark, and my dogs know that we are at the hour mark, so they are bugging me like nobody's business. So, but thank you everybody for being here. It's the last bit of e-begging. As I said, I owe my mother money because I was either going to drop the dog or I was going to drop the iPad. So I dropped the iPad. So my mom's deal is that I need to make $100 a month. And I think if everybody just chips in a little bit each month, I can reach that goal. So this is my Cash App. If any of you lovely souls want to give me even just $5, that would get me a little bit there, because otherwise I actually have to like do scary things like dog sitting, which I don't know if I can do with my other dogs, or I have to try other ways of making it. And I told my mom, no. There are people who make money at YouTube. So, and part of it is to pay for the funds that I use for, you know, the streaming app and everything like that. And then this will be my Subscribe Star as soon as I am approved by Subscribe Star. So go ahead and write that down. Yeah, I'm sorry to have to e-bag like this, but you know, if you guys just could, I mean, you know, heck, if I make enough money, I can even get a microphone and get better sound quality to you guys. You know, wouldn't that be cool? So yeah, please write this down. Subscribe Star Pam-Curtis. That's going to be my place there. And it's not approved yet. So if you want to help out right now, my Cash App is Pam Curtis 3. So I really appreciate it, you guys. And thank you for being here tonight. Such cool conversations. And yeah, crows may be smarter than monkeys. Right below us in intelligence, right up there with cats, the New Caledonian crows in particular, also the African gray. That one is a really interesting bird. There was one that was super, super smart that knew human language and would literally talk. So, but yeah, thanks everybody for stopping by. The universe is an interesting place for sure. Yeah, I love every one of you, all of my Pam fam. Even if I don't make any money at this, you know, I just want to try it with YouTube to start. And if I don't make it through YouTube, I'll find another way to do it. But I will continue to bring you guys content. I will never, ever quit. So, all right, you guys, with that, I will wish you all a good night and catch you guys next week. Thursday night, 5:30, so that people can come home from work safely. Yeah, then Saturday night at 5:00. So love you. And everyone here. Yep. Love the Pam fam. So yeah, I love all you guys. And yeah, I will see you all next week. Bye. Yes, Free. 1 second. I'm saying goodbye to everybody. I know you can't hear them. Free's going to come say goodbye. So I gotta go deal with her now. Good night, all.